Have you ever asked yourself, do people truly care? Or are they simply skilled at exploiting your kindness? That isn't a shallow question. It marks the beginning of an essential inward journey, one that reveals the true nature of your relationships. In a world as complex as ours, not everyone who smiles at you stands with you. At times, it's those closest to you who master the art of subtle manipulation. With the calm discernment of Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic emperor, we can learn to distinguish between sincerity and deceit. There are 10 subtle tactics manipulators use to make you doubt yourself, gradually eroding your trust and self-command. Recognizing them is the first step toward building healthier connections, and more importantly, shielding yourself from toxic ties. This isn't merely about avoiding pain. It's about living in alignment with your true worth. 1. Don't react instantly. Observe first. In daily life, we tend to react too quickly. A single disrespectful comment, an unpleasant attitude, or even an ill-timed silence, and we snap. We respond with words, with actions, with defensiveness or anger, and more often than not, we regret it afterward. The sad truth is, most of these reactions don't come from reason, but from emotion, flaring up in moments of lost control. Stoicism teaches that this is exactly the weakness manipulators exploit. For the more reactive we are, the easier we are to steer. Marcus Aurelius once emphasized that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies the power to choose. If we learn to pause, to observe, and to think before we act, we reclaim the control that should never have been surrendered. When someone deliberately provokes you with criticism, sarcasm, or even excessive praise, they are testing how easily you are swayed. If you react instantly, you confirm that they hold power over your emotional state. And once you allow someone else to control how you feel, you've already stepped into the trap. In today's social landscape, whether at work or in personal relationships, not reacting immediately is not weakness. On the contrary, it's a sign of inner strength, of someone with depth and deliberate insight. Imagine a scenario. Someone insults you in front of others. A reactive person might lash out, fire back, or throw a tantrum. And what remains is the image of someone out of control. But how would a Stoic respond? They pause. They observe. They let the emotion arise, but don't let it steer the wheel. They think, is this person truly trying to hurt me? Or are they just revealing their own insecurity? Will my response serve my long-term values? Or is it just a momentary strike back? And in that internal questioning, they reaffirm a kind of freedom no one can take away. What matters most here is realizing that we have the right not to react instantly. Emotions arise naturally, but reacting from emotion is a choice. And it's a choice a Stoic never delegates to someone else. When you stay silent while others expect a reaction, that's when you hold the upper hand. When you don't respond to provocation, that's when you preserve your composure. And when you can watch others without being pulled into their behavior, that's when you live by your own standard, not the one they impose. Remember, manipulators aren't always villains. Sometimes they are loved ones, colleagues or friends, people who've unintentionally learned how to sway others through emotion. But that matters less than your own ability to protect your emotional autonomy. The Stoic doesn't try to change the world out there. They train themselves to remain grounded despite it. And it all begins with the pause. To pause is not to surrender. It's an intentional act, a moment to observe, to ask, does this really matter? To remind yourself, I don't have to respond the way they want me to. And when you can do that, you don't just resist manipulation. You become a deeper, steadier version of yourself. 2. Beautiful promises mean nothing without action. We grow up in a world where promises are used like emotional currency. The more elegantly they are spoken, the more trust they seem to earn. Someone might promise to always be there, to help when we're in need, to change, to become better. But time passes, and all we're left with is silence, broken words, and sometimes forgetfulness. At first, we make excuses for them. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they forgot these. Maybe they haven't had the chance. But if we listen to our inner voice, we'll confront a harsher truth. Many promises were never meant to be kept. They were meant to keep us waiting, hoping, and eventually disappointed. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, had no faith in eloquent speech. To him, a good person doesn't need to say they're good. They simply live that way, daily. He didn't teach us to be cynical or cold, but he reminded us a person's worth isn't measured by what they say to moments of heightened emotion, but by what they do when no one's watching. Some will promise to love you forever, but vanish when you're at your weakest. Some will offer help, but disappear when you need it most. And some will use promises as tools to stretch out a dying relationship, keeping you clinging to a better version of them that's always promised to arrive tomorrow. The Stoic doesn't hate promises, but they're not blinded by them either. They understand that words without follow-through are a subtle form of manipulation. Why? Because a promise creates hope, and when someone else controls your hope, they control your behavior. They can make you endure just a little longer, wait a little more, forgive one more time, and in the process, he says, you slowly lose your self-respect. Not every person who breaks a promise intends to hurt you, but that doesn't change the outcome. Your trust was misplaced. Stoic wisdom teaches us to judge by action, not by sweet emotion. Someone who is truly committed doesn't need to talk much. They simply act. And if someone repeatedly fails to do what they say, no matter how beautiful their words, those words are hollow. Don't let them obscure the truth. Pay attention to the little things. Do they show up on time? Do they remember what you asked of them? Do they offer help without being asked? These are far clearer indicators than any long-winded vow. A Stoic expects little from others, but they are not naive, because they know being lenient with words often leads to being wounded by inconsistent behavior. Learning to distinguish between words and action doesn't make you jaded, it makes you grounded. You stop blindly believing every "I will" that lacks follow-through. You begin to judge others based on evidence, not expectation. And that's when you start living by your own values, instead of waiting in the shadows of someone else's promises. The truth is, if we look honestly, we've all been victims of beautiful promises, and sometimes the ones making them too. So learn to live as someone who keeps their word, quietly and consistently, and at the same time, protect yourself by only trusting what has been proven through action. When you do that, you're no longer easily manipulated. You begin to choose relationships based on sincerity, not illusion. You live in the present, not in unsupported hopes, because in the end, what makes a person trustworthy isn't what they say, it's the unhearing way they live, day in and day out. 3. A healthy relationship always involves both giving and receiving. There is something we're rarely taught clearly. Love, friendship, or any relationship requires a balance between giving and receiving. That doesn't mean everything must be perfectly measured. But one person can't keep giving while the other only takes, oblivious to the other's worth. If you're always the one reaching out, the one listening, the one compromising, sacrificing time, energy, and emotion, while the other is never truly present, what you're part of isn't a relationship, but a slow depletion of your emotional reserves, often called Emotional dependence. Stoicism doesn't teach us to be selfish. It teaches us to have self-respect and self-protection. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, often emphasized the use of reason to see things as they truly are. Even in relationships, if you constantly find yourself clinging to connections where only you are trying to hold things together, you're living contrary to Stoic wisdom. For a Stoic does not chase validation, nor do they trade their inner peace to keep someone who has already chosen to drift away. Remember, a healthy relationship doesn't need to be conflict-free or constantly cheerful, but it must have mutual respect, shared effort, and genuine presence. Meaning, when you need them, they're there. When you open up, they listen with care, not just toss back a surface-level reply. Most importantly, they make you feel like you don't have to perform to earn love. You're accepted as you are. In contrast, one-sided relationships, whether in love, friendship, or family, leave you drained, not because you're not good enough, but because your kindness is offered to someone who doesn't know how to receive it. A manipulator doesn't always harm you with obvious actions. Sometimes, all it takes is silence at the wrong moment, indifference when it matters most, or pulling away when you need them near to make you doubt yourself. They don't wound with force. They do it with absence, and that pain runs just as deep as betrayal. The Stoic is intentional about setting boundaries in relationships. They do not fear solitude because they understand peaceful solitude is better than shared turmoil. They don't need many people, just the right ones, those to whom they can give freely and from whom sincerity is returned without begging. This isn't demanding, it's clarity and values. If you're in a relationship where you must strain to be loved, pause, not to walk away immediately, but to evaluate what's truly happening. Is this just a difficult phase or a chronic imbalance? Is the other person unable to give or simply unwilling? The answer isn't always easy to hear, but a Stoic will always choose truth over illusion, because truth, even when bitter, frees us from emotional spirals we never needed to enter. And here's the final truth. Don't be afraid to withdraw from unhealthy relationships. It's not failure. It's a conscious step in maturity. You don't have to keep being the one who always listens when no one listens to you. You don't have to keep acting strong just to uphold a bond that quietly weakens you. You deserve love, respect, and above all, you owe it to yourself not to keep giving endlessly where no empathy remains. A healthy relationship isn't born from perfection, but from two people who try, who are honest, and who show up for each other. Not just when life is easy, but especially when it's hard. That's the kind of relationship worth holding on to. 4. Respecting your own emotions is the first step to earning respect from others. One of the most common mistakes we make when entering any relationship, be it friendship, love, or work, is shrinking our feelings to avoid inconveniencing others. We stay silent when hurt, force a smile when we're unhappy, and step back when we should speak up for fairness. We believe that the less trouble we cause, the more we'll be appreciated. But the truth is far harsher. When you don't respect your own emotions, no one else will either. Marcus Aurelius and the Stoic thinkers never taught us to suppress or ignore emotions. Quite the opposite. They taught us to understand them, observe them, and respond with reason rather than react impulsively. A key part of that process is acknowledging your emotions as a valid part of being human. So when you feel sadness, disappointment, anger, or pain, you don't need to hide it, nor pretend to be strong. The Stoic doesn't run from emotion. They move through it, study it, and examine how it shapes thought and action. It is this honesty with emotion that builds true resilience. In unhealthy relationships, Emotional manipulation often starts with someone making you feel like your feelings are the problem. They'll say you're too sensitive, too reactive, too complicated, and if you're not grounded, you'll begin to question yourself. You'll start reshaping who you are to be less emotional, easier to deal with, less exhausting. But the more you shrink, the more they take. They begin to treat your patience as default, your silence as agreement, your pain as insignificant. At that point, you're no longer a full person in their eyes, just a shadow they can mold. The Stoic does not allow this. They don't shout to be heard, but neither do they silence their inner truth to maintain a false peace, because they understand you teach others how to treat you, starting with how you treat yourself. When you respect your emotions, you'll know how to say no without guilt, how to say I'm not okay without shame, how to walk away from spaces where your feelings are dismissed. And those around you, if they have any decency and reason, will begin to adjust their behavior in response to the healthy boundaries you've set. Self-respect is not arrogance. It's the affirmation that your voice deserves to be heard, your feelings understood, just like anyone else's. Your emotions don't need to make sense to others to be valid. They matter because they're real, and the sooner you accept that, the less vulnerable you'll be to those who turn your feelings into burdens. If someone consistently makes you feel ashamed for opening up, take a hard look at that relationship. If you constantly have to explain why you were sad, why you were disappointed, to someone who always dismisses those feelings, perhaps the issue isn't you. Respect cannot be one-sided. One of the clearest signs of a healthy relationship is that both people feel safe being themselves, both in strength and in vulnerability. The Stoic doesn't seek approval from the crowd. They seek alignment between thought, feeling, and action. And to do that, you must begin by treating your own emotions with kindness, not denial, not judgment, just attention and respect. When you do, you not only shield your inner world from unnecessary damage, you create a life of depth, where you no longer have to sacrifice your soul just to be seen. 5. Don't let flattery mixed with criticism control your emotions. There's a subtle form of manipulation many fall into without noticing. It happens when we're kept in a relationship through sweet praise, laced with steady drops of criticism. The manipulator doesn't confront directly. They compliment you just enough to make you feel seen, but criticize you just enough to make you feel like you were never quite enough. They highlight your strengths, then quickly follow with a reminder to try harder, be more careful, tone it down, or just tweak this one thing and you'd be perfect. These comments may sound like helpful suggestions, but when repeated deliberately, they start to erode your sense of worth. The Stoic, like Marcus Aurelius, reminds us, no one can make you feel small unless you grant them that power. And that's especially true when it comes to how others manipulate our emotions through words. When praise is followed by criticism, and criticism by praise, your mind is pulled into a loop. Am I truly good enough? Am I lovable? What must I change to be accepted? And then you start to shift, not because you want to grow, but because you fear losing their approval. Fear the compliments might stop. Slowly, your independence of thought fades, and with it, your emotional stability. Stoicism teaches us that our value doesn't come from temporary praise, but from living in line with our inner principles. If you must constantly reshape yourself just to be admired, if your heart is always anxious, waiting for someone's next reaction, this is no longer a relationship. It's emotional conditioning. They don't need to shout or threaten. They simply keep you in the zone of almost enough, but not quite, so you'll keep striving, keep proving, keep giving, never feeling complete. A typical example: you share a success, and they respond, "That's great, but if it were me, I'd take it even further." Or, "You've got real potential, if only you weren't so emotional." Wrapped in a sweet tone, such lines carry a hidden message. You're not entitled to your own pride. These comments chip away at your self-respect and create a toxic cycle. You begin living for their judgment, worrying about their next critique, performing instead of being. The Stoic refuses to let praise or criticism dictate their emotional landscape. They take in feedback, but never surrender the right to define themselves. They understand praise is just opinion, and so is criticism, both filtered through someone else's lens. Neither adds to nor subtracts from their actual worth. They remain unmoved by flattery and steady in the face of critique because they know who they are, what they live for, and won't let anyone steer their feelings with half-truths in kind words. To avoid falling into this kind of emotional trap, begin by noticing how you feel after interacting with them. Do you feel uplifted or diminished? Are you inspired to grow, or caught in a loop of trying to prove yourself? If you often feel not enough, it may not be because something's missing in you, but because someone wants you to feel that way, so they can stay in control. Once you see it, use Stoic reasoning as your mirror. You don't reject all feedback, but you only absorb what is true and useful for your own growth. The rest, you let pass like the wind, because in the end, a rational person isn't someone who needs no praise, but someone who doesn't let praise or blame steer their inner compass. And when you live that way, no one, not even the most polished manipulator, can control you. Not with sweetness, not with subtle attacks against your self-worth. 6. Don't confuse superficial presence with true support. Some people always show up when you succeed, when you shine, when there is something about you they can proudly say, "I know that person." They interact, check in, and even offer congratulations, polished, polite, and socially appropriate. It's easy to mistake that for care, for friendship, for something real. But one day, when everything falls apart, when you lose your job, your direction, or your sense of self, they go silent. No check-ins, no presence, not even a word of comfort. That's when you begin to realize surface-level presence is not the same as genuine support. Stoic philosophy has always been about essence, not appearance. Marcus Aurelius never judged a person by their words or formal attendance. He looked at how they acted when there was no personal gain, when the glamour faded, when the relationship offered nothing in return. And if you learn to see clearly, as a Stoic does, you'll begin to distinguish those willing to walk through storms with you from those who only linger in sunshine. In life, we often place too much value on relationships that look full. You might have hundreds of social media connections, dozens who engage with you, a few who meet for coffee. But when you fall apart, when you truly need someone to just sit beside you, listen without judgment, and offer no shallow advice, those people might not fill one hand. Sadly, we tend to discover this only after a major collapse. Real support is not someone showing up in a role. It's someone showing up with their heart. The manipulative don't always do obvious harm. They simply create the illusion of being present. They'll casually ask, "How have you been?" but never stay long enough to hear the answer. They'll comment on your happy moments, but vanish when sadness shows. They want a place in your life, but not the weight of your reality. A Stoic sees through this kind of bond. They understand that a true relationship isn't measured by how often someone appears, but by how deeply they are present when it counts. When you live with Stoic clarity, you no longer get swept into hollow connections. You don't need crowds. You need sincerity. You learn to let go of those who make you feel alone, even when you're sitting right beside them. And in return, you deeply value the ones who sit in silence with you and stay. Because you know, real support isn't about how much someone says. It's about how they show up, when, and how it matters. Genuine support doesn't always require solutions. Sometimes, a simple message like, "I have no words but I'm here with you," is enough to keep you going. A Stoic doesn't expect others to save them, but they're wise enough to know who is worth keeping and who should be released to make space for peace and stillness. Don't confuse someone who's always around when you're happy with someone who stays when you're vulnerable. Don't assume that someone knowing you're hurting means they care about that pain. And don't let anyone convince you that "I've just been busy" is a valid excuse for repeatedly disappearing when you need a shoulder. Everyone's busy. The ones who truly care will find a way. Not out of obligation, but because they genuinely want to be there. We don't need a lot of people in our lives, just a few real ones. And more importantly, we need the strength to recognize that we deserve relationships that don't need to be flashy, but are quietly, unwaveringly present when we need them most. 7. Unhealthy competition only breeds envy. We grow up in a world where competition is seen as inevitable, sometimes even essential, for survival and success. From an early age, we're taught to outshine others, to be faster, smarter, better, more exceptional in order to be recognized. As we grow older, the competition becomes fiercer. At work, in school, even in our personal lives, we're swept into a cycle of constant comparison. Of income, achievement, appearance, even things as intimate as happiness, or how much love we receive. And once comparison becomes the measure of self-worth, envy becomes unavoidable. Stoics never denied our natural tendency to look to others to define where we stand, but they warned that ceased looking is meaningless without inward reflection. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Don't waste your time examining the faults of others when you've yet to understand the chaos within your own mind." Competition itself isn't the problem, but when it's fueled by insecurity, envy, and the need to win, it becomes a subtle form of self-destruction. Because at that point, you're no longer living to grow. You're living to outpace someone else. And the price you pay is your inner peace. Envy often doesn't come from strangers, but from those closest to us. Friends, colleagues, even family. It starts with harmless seeming questions like, "Why did she make it, but I didn't?" Or, "Why is he praised while I'm ignored?" And slowly festers into dissatisfaction, resentment, and a quiet, unspoken rivalry. Meanwhile, the other person may be completely unaware. They've become a symbol of your silent struggle. And just like that, you find yourself trapped in a race no one else is running. No one else is watching. And the farther you go, the more exhausted you become. The Stoic chooses to step out of that pointless race. They have nothing to prove to anyone else, only a need to ensure they are more grounded today than they were yesterday. They understand envy grows when you focus on someone else's results and forget your own journey. Someone achieving something before you doesn't make them more valuable. They are simply walking their path while you're still learning to walk yours. If you only use others as benchmarks, you'll always feel lacking. But if you measure yourself against who you were yesterday, you'll witness true progress. Unhealthy competition doesn't just distance you from others. It distances you from yourself. You start acting not from principle, but from the need to power. Your thoughts lose their freedom, controlled by how others might perceive your every move. You grow bitter when others succeed, instead of being glad they achieved something meaningful. And the tragic part is this: the more you envy, the more you rob yourself of the chance to learn from those who could have inspired you. The Stoic trains themselves to see another's success as proof that good things are possible, and that with patience and integrity, they too can achieve what's right for them in their own time. They don't compete with others. They compete with the stagnation and negativity within. They don't aim to surpass others. They aim to rise above the weaker version of themselves from yesterday. That is the only competition worth joining. 8. Those who are always absent when you need them don't belong in your life. There's a simple truth that's hard to accept. People who truly belong in your life don't disappear when you need them most. Showing up at the right time isn't a grand gesture, but it's one of the clearest signs that separates meaningful connection from momentary association. We've become too used to accepting people's absence as a normal part of life. We make excuses for them. They are busy. They have their own lives. They don't know what you need. But deep down, we all know this. If someone truly cares, they'll find a way to be there without needing to be asked. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "A person reveals their true nature, not in times of ease, but when adversity arrives." A Stoic doesn't expect others to be present at all times, but they are keen observers of who remains when darkness falls. Because being there in hard times isn't just about offering help. It's a silent way of saying, "You're not alone." In contrast, someone's repeated and prolonged absence whenever you need encouragement, understanding, or just a hand to hold, that's no longer coincidence. It's a choice. And if someone chooses not to show up when it matters most, you're allowed to choose not to keep them in your life. The Stoic doesn't harbor bitterness, nor do they judge harshly. They simply remain honest with themselves. They don't see someone's departure as failure, but as a natural form of filtering. Because they understand, relationships should exist only when both sides feel valued, truly present, not just when life is smooth, but especially during storms. Someone who's always absent may not be a bad person, but clearly, they no longer align with your emotional compass. And holding on to them, waiting for change, doing everything to make them stay, only wears down your peace. You may have believed that relationships are defined by time, by how long you've known someone, by the memories you share. But the truth is, someone who just arrived but chooses to listen when you are overwhelmed is worth more than someone who's been around for years, yet always vanishes when you need them. Time doesn't define the quality of connection. Presence does. The Stoic is always clear-eyed when evaluating the bonds in their life. They don't fear letting go, because they know holding on to people who are no longer genuine only leads them away from what matters most. Don't keep someone just because you once loved them. Ask yourself, where were they when I needed them most? If your answer is an echoing silence, then maybe you've known the truth all along. Your mind did, even if your heart wasn't ready to admit it. The Stoic acts according to reason, not emotion. They refuse to let feelings keep them chained to what no longer serves their growth. They understand that sometimes someone leaving isn't a loss. It's a necessary release, allowing you to move forward, lighter and freer. And most importantly, you don't have to blame anyone for their absence. All you need is to learn how to be fully present in your own life. When you do that, the right people will naturally find their way to you. As for the rest, they simply no longer have a role to play in your path toward maturity. 9. Friendship cannot be one-sided. Friendship is one of the most sacred relationships a person can have, but also one of the easiest to misunderstand. Unlike romantic love, friendship carries fewer formal commitments, fewer measurable expressions. That's why we often accept relationships labeled as friendship, when in truth, Only one side is doing the work. You're the one who always reaches out, checks in, plans the meetups. You're the one who listens when they're exhausted, helps when they're in need, shows up when they fall apart. But when it's your turn to share, you find yourself quietly buried on their list of priorities. No message, no reply, just prolonged silence, and maybe, eventually, an empty apology. The Stoic never lets emotion overrule reason, and that clarity helps them see one simple truth. Friendship, to be real and lasting, cannot be one-sided. If you're always the one giving, while the other never initiates, never reciprocates, you're sustaining an unbalanced relationship. The more effort you pour in, the more you try to keep the bond alive, the more you disempower yourself, because the other person begins to assume you'll always be there, always initiating, always enduring, and slowly, you lose not only their respect but worse, your own. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You don't need to chase what doesn't come to you naturally." Real friendship shouldn't exhaust you. It flows like breath, like a heartbeat, mutual, shared. When one side goes silent, while the other shouts into a void, that's no longer friendship, it's loneliness, dressed in familiar clothing. A Stoic does not beg for affection. They step back, observe, and allow the truth to reveal itself. They don't resent those who no longer walk beside them. They simply accept that some people are only meant to accompany you for part of the journey, and there's nothing wrong with that. Friendship requires mental presence, sincere care, and a willingness to give and receive. No one wants a friend who only shows up when things are easy, then disappears when you need a shoulder. No one thrives in a connection where every interaction must be initiated from one side, because you, too, have limits. You have emotions. You deserve to be heard, to be seen as a whole person, not just a dumping ground for someone else's fatigue. The Stoic doesn't fear solitude, because solitude with dignity is far better than companionship that is shallow, draining, and unfair. And eventually, you must be brave enough to stop texting first, to stop checking in, to stop making plans on their behalf, not out of bitterness or punishment, but because a real relationship must be mutual, never an obligation carried by one alone. When you let go of a one-sided friendship, you're not losing a friend. You're reclaiming the balance you've been sacrificing for far too long. And in that letting go, you'll rediscover the peace that a true friendship should have offered you from the very beginning. 10. Betrayal doesn't break you. How you respond does. No one enters a relationship expecting to be betrayed. We trust, we hope, and sometimes we hand over our whole heart to someone else. That's why betrayal, whether in love, friendship, or any form of connection, often begins with numbness. It's a breathless disappointment, a severing of something we once believed was firmly bound. But once the shock fades, we're faced with a choice. Will we allow the betrayal to shape us through bitterness, or will we consciously choose how to respond? Marcus Aurelius never denied the pain of betrayal, but he made one thing clear: no one can harm your soul unless you give them permission. A Stoic never sees themselves as a victim. They take full responsibility for their emotions and actions. When betrayed, they don't sink into resentment, because they understand that long-held resentment punishes no one but the person holding it. It keeps you tied to a wound that might otherwise heal. Betrayal is someone else's action, but the enduring pain is shaped by how we interpret that action. If we tell ourselves we were devalued, disrespected, or dismissed, the wound deepens. But if we view betrayal through reason, as a reflection of their character, not a verdict on our worth, we stop it from touching our core. That doesn't mean ignoring the pain or pretending to be unaffected. It means acknowledging the wound without letting it dictate who we become. A Stoic responds with dignity. They may walk away, end the relationship, or speak truth plainly, but they don't seek revenge, don't broadcast the harm, and don't allow pain to twist them into someone bitter. Because they understand, retaliation only makes you a distorted reflection of the one who hurt you. And that, too, is a form of self-betrayal. You don't have to pretend nothing happened, but you don't have to prove anything either. Sometimes, quiet withdrawal is the most powerful response to betrayal, because when you don't react the way they expect, you retain your strength. More importantly, you send a clear message. I may be hurt, but I'm not broken. I may be disappointed, but I haven't lost myself. Betrayal doesn't kill you. It's a scratch along the path, not the end of it. What truly determines whether you overcome it is the attitude you carry afterward. Will you wear the pain as armor, or use it to sharpen your mind and strengthen your resolve? The Stoic chooses the latter. They turn wounds into wisdom, pain into the discipline, not a weight that pulls them backward. And if you're in the midst of betrayal now, remember, you don't have to react right away. You only need to return to your core values and ask yourself, what response will I be proud of later? Then act accordingly. Because in the end, how you respond to betrayal says far more about you than what they did in the first place. When I first started practicing Stoicism, I didn't expect to become perfect, emotionless, or immune to pain. What I hoped for was to preserve a quiet space within where I could observe myself, pause before reacting, and stop being blindly pulled into other people's emotions. I realized manipulation doesn't always appear as obvious wrongdoing. Sometimes it comes disguised as care, as promises, or as encouragement. And if you're not mindful, it's easy to find yourself living in a state of waiting, performing, and striving to be accepted, rather than living in alignment with your own values. Since I began slowing down and paying closer attention to how people react to me and how I respond to them, I've started to clearly see one-sided relationships, to notice who stays when I'm no longer strong, and to recognize that even compliments can be forms of control. I no longer place weight on hollow words. I'm no longer sensitive to being ignored. And most importantly, I no longer fear letting go of relationships that lack sincerity. To me, practicing Stoicism isn't about becoming rigid. It's about having boundaries, using reason, and finding peace from within. Regardless of the chaos outside, life will always bring people who make you question your worth. But if you train yourself long enough to stand firm with within, no one can manipulate you again. You don't need to force anything to prove yourself. You just need to live by the principles you believe in and let your actions speak for themselves. If today's lesson helped you reflect more deeply on your relationships, your reactions, or how you protect your emotional freedom, then that's a powerful sign that you're moving in the right direction. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss future videos. And share this with anyone who's also on the journey to reclaim their inner peace. Because ultimately, what we're seeking is not just the ability to spot manipulation, but the kind of inner strength that can rise through pain, recover from betrayal, and keep living with an unshakable calm. See you in the next video.